So, let's get into Battleship Potemkin. And I wanted to start with just a little context before we get into the movie itself. So, in 1904, 1905 was the Russo-Japanese War. And basically, my understanding is that both of these countries were kind of getting the imperial mindset, after I'm sure everybody's trying to take a piece of the pie of anything Britain hadn't taken yet. So both Russia and Japan at the same time were very interested in that, Pacific Ocean, kind of near the water of both countries. So the east coast for Russia, and then the sea and kind of to the west of Japan, and they both kind of wanted to start taking over areas like Manchuria and Korea, and basically butted heads because of that.
Right. Well, Russia was looking to expand its influence in Manchuria and Korea to try and get a warm water port on their east coast.
Oh, right.
Because I guess the ones that they had were only accessible during the summer. And then Japan was basically trying to kind of start to impose itself as a major world power and wanted to bring Manchuria and Korea into its own sphere of influence. And so that's what kind of started the war, the Russo-Japanese War.
So they went ahead, and it sounds like Japan wasn't necessarily looking for a prolonged fight and was probably agreeable to compromise. And actually, I think they said they would concede Manchuria if Russia would give them Korea, and Russia was like, nah.
Right. So basically, Japan started winning, like, almost right off the bat. Well, I think that they attacked Russia first, actually.
There was even a sneak attack on a naval base, very reminiscent of Pearl Harbor, but before they had planes.
Exactly. And then they were like, hey, let's, they wanted to engage in peace talks. But by this point, Tsar Nicholas II, who was the Tsar of Russia at the time, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to win the war. So basically, Japan kind of started off beating them and then said, hey, maybe let's not do this war. Let's have these peace talks. And Tsar Nicholas was just like, no, not interested. But it was Teddy Roosevelt, the U.S. president at the time, started doing some kind of like, backdoor dealings with both of the countries and ended up getting them both to come to the peace talk table, and they signed the Treaty of Portsmouth, and Teddy Roosevelt actually got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for it.
Oh, dang. And yeah, so basically it sounds like Nicholas was just that confident that even though they were not doing well early in the conflict, that they would still be able to come back and be victorious. And he was wrong. The Japanese just kind of kicked their butt. And so basically it was a huge embarrassment, yeah.
Yeah, and it was the first time in the modern era anyway that an Asian power defeated a European power, and this kind of is the beginning of the modern Japanese empire that we'll see in future episodes in the run up to like World War II.
No, it is fascinating that basically, it was kind of, Japan was definitely the underdog and not taken seriously, and basically as a result of this conflict became kind of overnight a major world player, or at least someone to be reckoned with, which they had not been seen to be at all before. And then now this ties into just what we're going to get into with what's going on with Russia at the time. So we're going to get into they call it the Russian Revolution of 1905. And what I'm reading here says there's kind of 4 things that maybe in and of themselves wouldn't have been enough to cause major problems. But all these things at once, the tensions were just so high that a lot of stuff started going down. So obviously there was, dealing with the war not going well. So a lot of ethnic minorities that weren't getting along with the government, and the government was being very oppressive and trying to kind of be pure in a sense that might be foreshadowing of what, the Germans end up doing. You have the working class. Again, we know in Russia, that's going to be what ultimately comes to a head. The working class kind of resenting that the government isn't taking care of them. Just in the radical ideas of just overhauling civilization. And of course, we can't forget that, we talked about revolutions in our recap episode, that you had the American Revolution in 1776, you have the French Revolution in 1789. And yes, this is over 100 years later, but it's still kind of that same sentiment that the common people are just tired of these people at the top calling the shots. And so you have this Russo-Japanese war, and then you're sending of course, it's always the poor people that get sent to die in the war, and the Tsar is just like, oh yeah, we're just going to keep fighting even though we're losing.
Right. And it was in Russia, it's extra interesting because the first revolution actually failed. So the 1905 revolution, Tsar Nicholas II managed to keep power basically. Like he was successful in kind of, getting through it. But then in 1917, they basically just tried again. And that time they were successful and they, ended up executing the royal family, and the Bolsheviks established the Soviet Union at that point, which I don't know if are we gonna talk about that in a future episode?
Yes, because we'll be doing Dr. Zhivago down the line. And so that will definitely get into that. I was going to say, like, spoiler alert for the whole timeline of world history, Logan. Jeez. So, but yes, and Lenin, after the fact, would even say that the 1905 revolution was kind of a prelude to the 1917 revolution, which, as you said, was the only successful one. And 1905 was more just, I guess, maybe an earthquake, like maybe a pre-shock, or I don't know enough about earthquakes. Anyway, so, and then the quote, so getting to Battleship Potemkin, a 1925 silent film by Sergei Eisenstein, who we've actually seen before, he directed Alexander Nevsky and Ivan the Terrible, although both those movies were actually after this one. So this is 1925, about a 1905 event aboard the Battleship Potemkin. And again, so this is in this time of kind of high conflict and tension of just the different classes and different groups in Russia just not trusting each other, not getting along. So what we see in the movie now, and this movie's only like 70 minutes and really only has like a few scenes, and they're actually kind of really long, elaborate scenes, which you think for a silent movie would have maybe shorter scenes and shorter cuts, but really there's like, 3 scenes, and they're all just really long, and it just kind of takes its time. So the opening quote of the movie, and again, all the quotes are in title cards, but it's a quote from Lenin that says, "Revolution is war. Of all the wars known in history, it is the only lawful, rightful, just, and truly great war. In Russia, this war has been declared and begun." And supposedly Lenin actually said that in 1905, just 12 years before his Bolshevik Revolution will take over the whole country. So what we see in the film here is just kind of the sailors are grumbling that they don't really care for the officers and they don't really like the officers. And they're also talking about how they commiserate with their workers in the factories back at home. Now, of course, since this movie was made in 1925, some of these kind of sentiments could be kind of hyped up maybe more than what the sailors would have actually been saying on the ship, because, of course, this is ultimately Soviet propaganda.
Right. That's interesting. So this movie was made in 1925, kind of on the heels of the 1917 revolution.
Correct.
It's about the 1905 revolution. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yes, and actually, so the film was even made as part of like the 20th anniversary of the 1905 revolution. So it was kind of, it was even kind of like part of like, hey, let's kind of hype this up. And because they did see it as kind of the prelude to their ultimate takeover in 1917. So anyway, the main plot is triggered here when the men are basically grumbling about the available food supply and that they're basically serving them rotting meat. And they even have a doctor come out and he's expecting the hanging meat carcass thing. I don't know terms. And he says like, oh, well, these aren't worms. These are just maggots. Just wash them off and eat the darn thing.
Yeah, which is actually true. Well, I don't know if the quote is true, but like that was one of the main kind of drivers.
No, the movie's accurate. The movie's actually accurate. Yes,
the movie is almost like completely historically accurate. Like it's definitely a true story,
with possibly a shade of propaganda. But yes, the details are fairly accurate. Yes.
Yeah. So, and the rotten meat being an issue is in real life what actually kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back as far as the sailors, kind of try to take over the ship was concerned.
Right. There's one more big step in between, which is that, so they turn the meat into like a soup or a stew or whatever, and the men are still grumbling, but then, kind of the breaking point ends up being the men just refuse to eat it, and then not only that, they don't mutiny over necessarily the food itself, it's when one of the officers threatens to kill them for not eating the stew made from rotten meat. And they're like, oh, hell no.
Right. So going into this movie, I didn't really expect a silent film from 1925 to be as tense as this movie was.
Right.
But yeah, that scene where the captain calls everybody onto the deck and, basically asks, he's like, if you enjoyed the soup, step forward.
Right.
And like pretty much all the officers step forward. And then he like rounds up the ones that didn't and puts a tarp over them and has like the ship's guards basically do a firing squad, which is all true, which all actually happened.
Right. The tarp was even true, and he put the tarp over them so they wouldn't get blood all over everything. I was like, oh my gosh, this is like, I didn't expect that part to be true. And then, in the film, then basically part of the crew convinces, the soldiers who were firing, like, who are you firing on? What are you doing? And
Right.
I didn't see any numbers as far as how many were killed of the crew. Did you see anything about that when the shooting began?
It might have been only the one. Vakulinchuk was the only sailor killed. Or maybe he's just the only one mentioned here.
Wait, so I thought they actually killed people under the tarp because I saw them falling down. But I was kind of confused.
Oh no, I thought they were falling down because they were like, they thought they were gonna die. I thought that was just them kind of like falling to their knees thing.
Okay, no, and I'm not certain, and that's the problem with the silent film. And I even wrote that in my notes, is that you can't hear the gunshots because it's a silent film. So I'm like, wait, did they just get shot, or are they just falling down, and what's going on? Okay,
well, and that's the reason that I don't think that they got shot, because I think in a silent film you would, there would be some sort of sound cue, be it a drum or a cymbal or something, to indicate that a gun had been fired.
Okay, I did think that was a little unclear. And when we do get to the village of Odessa later, we do see smoke from the guns, so we know that there's firing there.
Right, yeah.
And even a little more blood, yeah.
Yeah, it says 7 of the 18 officers were killed, including the captain.
Yes, so when the soldiers then basically revolt because they refuse to just sit there and take this anymore, where they're literally being threatened with death for not eating soup, which again would make more sense plot-wise too if they weren't actually killed and they're mutinying just because of the threat of it. That they basically revolt. The firing squad basically is now on the crew's side, and they go and arm themselves. And the one guy who basically spoke up at first, who you just said his name, I can't pronounce it right, Volunichuk.
So
Vakulinchuk.
I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right either, but it looks like Vakulinchuk.
Yes. So he is historic. He is the one who is credited with kind of sparking this mutiny on board the Potemkin.
Right. So there's the two main guys in the true story, and I think they actually mention the other one by name in the movie, but they don't necessarily portray him as a leader in the mutiny later. But Vakulinchuk and Matashenko. And Vakulinchuk was killed in the initial mutiny, and then in real life, Matashenko was kind of the leader of the sailors who then took over the battleship.
Oh, okay, right, because Vakulinchuk was not around to lead after that because he was killed in the mutiny.
Right. Matashenko is the one who Vakulinchuk is talking to at the very beginning of the movie.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Kind of setting those two up. It is a little harder to follow. The footage is frankly kind of hard to see. I think it's just not clear quality anymore, and that could just be, I don't know if that's degradation or just obviously the quality of the cameras at the time, but a little hard to follow with as far as that goes. And I kind of struggled to kind of follow exactly, but basically, so after the crew takes over the ship, they end up near the town of the coastal city of Odessa. And there's just kind of basically the crowd is almost kind of like on the crew's side. And again, it's just kind of the whole 1905 thing where there's just a lot of anti-establishment and pro the people sentiment. So when the town hears that, the crew took over, they're all on the crew's side for the Potemkin. And of course, then they also use the death of Vakulinchuk or whatever to kind of help prop that up. So they actually in the film have his body kind of on display in the town with a sign that says "Killed for a plate of soup." And I think, and it did say online that in real life, yes, his funeral kind of became like this rallying point for a lot of the unrest in the town. Yeah.
At the beginning of the movie, one of them says, all of Russia has risen. So I think that's to indicate that the 1905 revolution has basically started already. And then, so I think that there's probably already a revolutionary sentiment in the town. And then the body of Vakulinchuk there with the, killed for a plate of soup. And then the rumors that spread throughout the town of the sailors that have taken over the ship was enough to kind of embolden the rest of the city to kind of tip them into full-fledged revolution.
Yes, and then we get to the episode on the staircase, which is amazing. And
Oh, before we go to the staircase, something that we were talking about yesterday, after they bring Vakulinchuk's body to shore and the town starts to come out to see, his body, and there's like a huge crowd, and there's this, stir with people, talking about revolutionizing, and then one guy in the crowd who's obviously pro-Tsarist trying to get the crowd's attention away from Tsarism, and he just yells, "Kill the Jews."
right, just out of nowhere.
Because,
yeah.
Right. And then the crowd just kind of beats the shit out of him.
Right. And that was interesting. And I guess I didn't think about it being a distraction tactic. I thought he was more just like, yeah, and while we're at it, and they were just kind of not having it. I didn't think about it being an intentional distraction tactic by a Tsarist, which makes a lot more sense. So yeah, basically, so the crowd is kind of revolting, and then the army kind of moves in, and all while the ship's just kind of hanging out on shore, I guess. Oh, and the people, actually, that was kind of a neat scene. So obviously, there's nothing for food on the Potemkin, and the people getting like all their little fishing boats and everything, and start taking food and supplies and everything out to the Potemkin, so they have stuff. And then the army arrives to kind of quell the town, and so you get this famous scene. And even if you've never seen Battleship Potemkin, you've seen homages to this staircase scene. And I was almost kind of laughing at first as far as how long are these freaking stairs? Because like it showed these people running down the stairs for like minutes and minutes and minutes. I was like, okay, how long are these stairs? Oh, and then you look up the picture. Oh no, these stairs, it was like 143 meters of stairs in this town of Odessa. It looks like I want to go to this place. It looks amazing. And I kind of read that basically it was just the way they figured out to get to the docks. Otherwise, it was just kind of like winding sidewalks, and there was no good way to get from the town to the shore until they put in this giant staircase that's just gorgeous, and it's just cool too to see. And it was there. I mean, it would have been there in 1905 when this happened. So just kind of a crazy scene, and the army just opens fire and is just killing civilians, and you get then the very iconic scene of a baby carriage slowly going down the steps after basically the mom gets killed, and as she's like dying, she like knocks her own kid's carriage, and it just starts slowly going down the stairs. Now, if that sounds familiar, you may have seen the scene in The Untouchables, which has a very different ending, however, to the baby going down the carriage. In The Untouchables, Andy Garcia slides in, and like as he's got like his guns drawn, does like the cool guy move and puts his foot up to save the carriage while he's still covering his buddy with the guns. Just one of the coolest scenes in cinema history. In Eisenstein's version, however, the baby dies.
Yes. So this sequence, the Odessa Steps scene, is actually pretty widely parodied. That lady, there's a shot of this famous shot from Battleship Potemkin where the lady, it cuts to her, cuts back to I think somebody shooting, and then cuts back to her, and she has one lens of her glasses shattered with like blood coming out of her eye, which was parodied in The Godfather in the death of Mo Green. When they're going around, when basically there's the cleansing of all the other mob guys, and when they kill Mo Green, he's in the massage parlor and they shoot him right in the glasses. And then also in Naked Gun 33 1/3, they have their own kind of Odessa Step sequence with O.J. Simpson and the Pope. So,
and I remember that being, and everything. I remember when I saw that, I just assumed it was reference to The Untouchables, which it could be as well. A lot of times in references, you get kind of tiers of reference, and you're referring to something that's referring. I've had athletes will quote a movie, and I'll be like, "Oh, that's from Casablanca," and they'll be like, "No, it's not. It's from Step Brothers." I was like, "Okay, fine. Well, Step Brothers was quoting Casablanca." So then, basically, and I gotta get a little confused on just who's on whose side and everything here. But basically, the next phase again, there's not a lot of scenes in the movie. You have we don't want to eat this food. We don't want you to kill us. The city's coming to help us. And then the final scene, like we're basically done with the movie. A bunch of ships come to basically confront the Potemkin. And it's this big standoff, basically one ship versus, I couldn't tell how many other ships are coming to get them, but a handful of ships versus the one ship with the rebels in charge.
They just said a squadron. So I don't know how many ships are in a squadron, but it's more than just one.
Right. And again, all this still basically in the movie is darn near exactly how it went down. So they even show like the ship kind of trains its guns on them, and the Potemkin is basically saying, "Hey, brothers, join us. Like we're not going to shoot you even though you have your guns pointed at us. we're your friends, and they got the guns drawn, and again, it's intense. Like, you don't know, again, because they don't know the Russian history, I guess. You don't know what's going to happen, and it's, the commanders are giving the orders, and then couldn't believe I almost teared up when they basically put the guns on the ship. They just kind of pull them back up and let the Potemkin just kind of pass right between them, and everyone's just yelling, brothers, unite, and yeah, I darn near teared up. It was kind of amazing, and that's the end of the movie. It's just kind of the successful uprising on the Potemkin and its role in the 1905 revolution, and again, as kind of the lighting the match for the 1917 revolution, with, of course, then the corollary that this is all Soviet propaganda, but it's not like they changed the facts fundamentally anyway.
Right. But this is actually a good example of, stuff that they slip in for propaganda. It's completely true that this happened, but when they're, going full steam ahead at the Russian squadron that shows up to basically sink them, the whole time they're just signaling, join us, right? They're not shooting at them. And then after they get through, the ships let them through their little blockade. It says that they were flying the flag of freedom over the Potemkin. And it's hard to tell in the movie, obviously, because it's black and white. But the Potemkin at that time was now sailing under a red flag. And that's their flag of freedom, the red flag of communism, basically.
And I read, too, so obviously black and white silent film, but I read for like one of the exhibitions, or one of the times they showed it, Eisenstein himself went through and colored the flag actually red for like 108 frames. So for a few seconds, when you're watching it in black and white in the 20s, you would have seen a red flag on the screen, and the crowd went wild.
Oh man. Okay, so I've seen like screenshots of the red flag over the Potemkin, but I thought that was just done like in Photoshop. But that's crazy to think that Eisenstein just went through and just colored it by hand.
Yeah, and he did a similar thing in Ivan the Terrible, where there's kind of this basically the scene where they're kind of getting like drunk or stoned or whatever, and this black and white movie suddenly has this whole red hue for about 5 minutes during this party scene. So definitely something. Again, Eisenstein was kind of this film innovator.
Oh man! So speaking of film innovation from Eisenstein, and another thing I didn't expect from a 1925 movie, when the captain, going back to the beginning of the movie, when the captain first calls all hands on deck, and he's basically yelling at all the sailors for not eating the soup, and he says, he calls forward, he says, everyone who enjoyed the soups, come forward. And then to the ones who stayed back, he said, I'll string you up from the yard, and points at it. And it cuts to the faces of the sailors turning to look at the yard. Then it cuts to the yard, which is the mast of the ship, basically, where they hang all the flags from.
Oh, yes.
And for a split second, two faint silhouettes of hanging bodies appear under the yard. And then it cuts back to the sailors and back to the yard, and they're gone. Right. Which I think probably had to blow people's minds in 1925. Like, did I really just see that?
Yeah, of course, you also think, though, too, like some of the first films, even from 10, 15 years before this, had major special effects. Like the Moliere movie, the trip to the moon and stuff. So
yeah,
I don't disagree, but I'm also saying that wasn't necessarily unprecedented. But if you're getting Eisenstein, I think you brought up the other day, too, that he basically invented the montage, and is given tons of credit for like just, we see montages still today. It's almost kind of like a trope of like, oh yeah, montage time, and we enjoy them most of the time. They're an important part of storytelling. They basically started with Sergei Eisenstein and his Russian movies.
Right, and specifically things like what's called metric montage, which is where you have the cuts happen every certain amount of time, or every X number of frames you cut, regardless of whatever's going on in action. Like, it's not motivated by an action on screen or a sound or anything.
Oh, it's a rhythm thing, yeah.
Yeah, which you see a lot, like in movies where people will, like shoot up drugs or something, and you have all those quick cuts, like just a couple frames of, a whole bunch of just like seemingly random clips kind of cut together real fast. That's a metric montage, and that was invented by Eisenstein.
Yeah, pretty cool. And before we follow up a little bit more on him, I wanted to follow up on the Potemkin itself, which basically, despite the kind of glorifying of it in the movie, based on what I was reading, the ship kind of had a anticlimactic end. So
Yeah.
basically, it sounds like the crew just kind of escaped to Romania, and then the ship ended up getting captured, and the men just kind of disappeared into Romania, and the ship ended up back with the Russians, and basically it was ultimately all for naught. It just kind of became this symbol, but really didn't accomplish anything.
Right. Yeah. So going back to the very beginning where we were talking about the Russo-Japanese War. So in 1905, you have this ongoing, very naval-heavy conflict going on the east coast of Russia. So the Russian Navy sent a lot of its more seasoned senior sailors and officers to the east coast to help, with the war effort. So at the time, and this is, kind of like a good example of, little things that have this kind of domino effect that lead to a lot bigger things. So because you have the Russo-Japanese War going on, you have the Russian Navy sending all of its senior guys to the east coast of Russia, which leaves the Black Sea fleets to be manned primarily by new recruits, fresh guys, which means they're a lot more susceptible to like dissension in the ranks for things like rotting meat, which is one thing I guess that they credit the mutiny or credit for the cause of the mutiny, is that a lot of these guys were relatively fresh new sailors. But anyway, in the true story, they take over the ship, and it happens almost exactly like it does in the movie. They do run a blockade, or they did run a blockade of Russian ships in real life. It wasn't quite as peaceful as it shows in the movie, where they're, brothers. They didn't get fired upon. A couple ships did try to ram them, though, but unsuccessfully. And then they basically just kind of sailed to Romania under their red flag, and they asked the Romanians for help, and the Romanians said, well, if you give us the battleship and let us fly a Romanian flag over it, we'll let you safely into the port. So they hoist the Romanian flag, but kind of in a last, little revolutionary action, right before they give the ship to the Romanians, they scuttle it, so it sank. But they got rescued anyway.
Right. And then the ship was salvaged, and it was even used in World War I, and the ship kind of has another history. Yeah. But yeah, it was interesting. And just quick geography, because it's not necessarily intuitive. So kind of as you were saying, so this all did happen on the Black Sea, so basically straight south of Ukraine, or modern Ukraine. It would have been part of Russia even in 1905, I believe, and even before the Soviet Union here, and then Romania is basically on the west side of the Black Sea, with Bulgaria just south of that. So it wasn't too far. And then Odessa, I mean, I don't see the scale here, but Odessa is probably just 150 miles from the Romanian border, if you were going to draw a line there.
Yeah,
it's kind of interesting too to look at what Russia was at the time. So we always think of, it's not like the geography of the former Soviet Union countries now is what it was before the Soviet Union. So the Russian Empire was the Russian Empire maybe even bigger than the Soviet Union itself, if I remember correctly? I'm not sure exactly what would have split off, but
I don't know.
The Russian Empire was big. So all the countries that split away after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were part of Russia. So like Eisenstein, for example, was born in what is now Latvia, but it wasn't Latvia then. It was just part of the Russian Empire. So yeah, he kind of studied it looks like he studied architecture and engineering, moved to Moscow, and just kind of, not even sure exactly how he got into filmmaking, but he was just a kind of a crazy talent for it, to the point that with the success of Battleship Potemkin worldwide, he was kind of invited to come out to Hollywood to try to do movies out there. But the problem was, you're in the late 20s and early 30s, and there's just this anti-communist sentiment that basically, even though he was kind of I don't think Eisenstein really cared about any of it. I don't think he was anti the Soviets or pro the Soviets. He was just a guy from there and was not super concerned with it, but it just kind of basically prevented him from actually being able to make any headway in Hollywood. So he'd get some projects like basically greenlit, and then someone else would come in and be basically like, now we're not letting the Russian do that. And so that would fall through. He ended up in Mexico trying to make a movie, and basically gets fired from that and kicked out of town before he can finish that. And so he ended up kind of dealing with a lot of depression and everything, because he basically was this great artist who just wasn't able to do his work. Ends up back in Russia doing more propaganda films for them, and mostly just kind of towing the line. I also read too, he became friends with like Shirley Chaplin and Upton Sinclair, and just seems like a guy who had an interesting life.
Yeah, and this is actually supposedly Battleship Potemkin was the favorite movie of both Charlie Chaplin and Billy Wilder.
Right,
Apparently, they both
right.
said that it was their favorite movie of all time. So, I mean, this guy has friends in high places as far as Hollywood is concerned, but like you said, unfortunately, because of the stigma attached to him being Russian, he just wasn't able to be very successful there, which is kind of a shame.
Right. So he's basically stuck making Russian propaganda films. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, the guy was a genius. Like he, invented methods of filmmaking that are still used today.
Right. And then dies of a heart attack when he's 50. So he just kind of he didn't get really fully realize his career while he was alive, and then that career still gets cut short. So yeah, just kind of a darn shame that we didn't get more movies from this guy. And for those still a little hesitant about the idea of watching a Russian silent movie from the 20s, I would say this is kind of the ultimate example of what I always talk about of a movie vegetable. I don't disagree that it's kind of maybe hard or boring to sit through 70 minutes of this. I was even kind of like almost nodding off about 20 minutes in, but then it is so compelling. I just kind of find myself back in. But it's a really good movie. You need to watch it. It goes by pretty quick. And yeah, I get that maybe it's hard to watch with our modern impatience. But again, movie vegetable, watch Battleship Potemkin. It's good for you.
And I think people would be surprised how much they enjoy it if they did just sit down and watch it. And I think one of the things that it has going for it now in 2019 is the fact that it's only an hour long. So it's not like other movies that we might talk about today where where you have to devote 3 hours to be able to finish it. Like you can find it on YouTube. It's just an hour long.
Yes, yeah, and because it's so old, I think you can kind of watch it guilt-free and free on YouTube.
Right.
I mean, I think it's probably in the public domain at this point. I don't know the exact laws, but yeah, it's a Russian movie from 95 years ago. Go ahead and watch it guilt-free on YouTube.
Yeah.
So that's all I have for this week on Battleship Potemkin. Next week, we will get into Embrace of the Serpent in Colombia. So we'll be back in that part of the world, and we will see you then.